Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into Operation Northwoods. Here is what you're going to get in this video. First, the Cold War chessboard that made wild ideas seem thinkable. Then, why Cuba's 1959 revolution set off alarms in Washington. Next, how the Bay of Pigs failure created the kind of pressure that makes leaders reach for drastic options. And finally, what Operation Northwoods actually proposed, why it was rejected, and what it still teaches us about power, consent, and the stories nations tell. Now, let's set the stage. After World War II, two superpowers stared each other down across the globe. On one side, the United States, on the other, the Soviet Union. It was more than a rivalry. It was an ideological contest, a military buildup, and a worldwide struggle to shape alliances and influence. Think of the planet as a vast board where every region, every port, every broadcast mattered. In that kind of environment, decisions often prioritize strategic advantage first and ethical reflection later. When the temperature of international politics runs that hot, small islands can cast very long shadows. Enter Cuba in 1959. Fidel Castro's revolution toppled the Batista regime and announced a new alignment with the Soviet Union. For US planners, that was not just a distant headline. A socialist state openly allied with Washington's chief rival signaled a direct challenge to American interests in the hemisphere. The move suggested new intelligence footholds, new military cooperation, and a narrative victory for the other side. Suddenly, what happened in Havana mattered in every cabinet room conversation. Was this a passing moment, or the first domino in a new regional story? That uncertainty magnified the sense of urgency. Then came the Bay of Pigs in 1961. A covert, CIA-backed effort aimed at toppling Castro collapsed into a public and painful defeat. The operation did not achieve its objective, and the political cost was immediate. For the Kennedy administration, the failure was more than a bad news cycle. It was a humiliation that deepened internal pressure to regain the initiative. When leaders feel cornered by events, they sometimes start asking riskier questions. What would it take to change the narrative? How far should a government go to manufacture momentum? These are the kinds of questions that begin to appear when geopolitical rivalry, revolutionary change, and recent embarrassment collide. So this is the world in which our main topic takes shape. A Cold War defined by high stakes and hair-trigger calculations. A Cuban revolution that signaled open alignment with the Soviet Union. And a failed invasion that produced both frustration and a search for options. Keep that frame in mind, because understanding this context is the key to understanding what comes next. Now that we've set the stage, let's move into the heart of the matter, Operation Northwoods itself. On March 13, 1962, a document was formally approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This wasn't just a memo passed around a table. It was a structured proposal, drafted and endorsed by the highest levels of military planning in the United States, and its objective was very clear: provoke U.S. intervention in Cuba. In plain language, it was a plan designed to create the conditions where war would feel not just possible, but necessary. At the center of this plan was General Lyman Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His leadership gave the proposal credibility inside the Pentagon. Lemnitzer was a seasoned officer, and when a man in his position lends his name to a document, it carries weight. This wasn't a rogue idea floating around in the lower ranks. It was born and nurtured at the top of America's military establishment. That fact alone should give us pause. But what really defined Operation Northwoods was the strategy it laid out: false flag operations. These are staged events, deliberately manufactured to look like the work of an enemy. In this case, the proposals described ways to make it appear that Cuba had attacked American interests. Imagine the gravity of that. Instead of reacting to genuine aggression, leaders were preparing to create the illusion of aggression in order to secure public consent for military action. It's the kind of logic that turns truth into a tool, and citizens into an audience for a performance staged by their own government. Think about how bold this was. In an environment already charged with Cold War paranoia, the Joint Chiefs weren't simply waiting for the next crisis, they were actively brainstorming how to build one from scratch. And behind it all was the belief that if the American people could be shown the right kind of threat, their skepticism would disappear, and their demand for action would rise. That is Operation Northwoods at its inception, a plan drafted at the highest level, carrying the signature of America's military leadership and resting on the audacious idea of manufacturing reality itself. And as we'll see next, the scenarios they envisioned were far more elaborate and far more chilling than most citizens could ever imagine. Now let's open the actual blueprint of Operation Northwoods, the proposed scenarios. And here's where the plan stops being abstract and becomes deeply unsettling. The Joint Chiefs didn't just suggest vague deception, they laid out specific, detailed operations designed to shock, to horrify, and to rally the public against Cuba. First, fabricated attacks. The proposals included staging bombings on U.S. soil, cities, military installations, even possibly orchestrated incidents that would cause real damage to American property and lives. The idea was simple and terrifying: make it look like Cuba struck first, so retaliation would seem both justified and inevitable. Think about that. Attacking your own people, or at least creating the impression of it, to mobilize a nation for war. Then there were staged hijackings. Imagine a commercial airliner, an ordinary passenger plane, suddenly reported as hijacked by Cuban operatives. In reality, the plan suggested replacing it with a drone, carefully substituted to mimic the flight. The supposed passengers would be safe, but the spectacle would be presented as an act of Cuban aggression. It's the kind of theater that blurs the line between reality and illusion, between fact and narrative. But the plan didn't stop at explosions and aircraft. It also leaned heavily on media manipulation. The architects of Northwoods understood the power of controlled narratives. If the press carried the right images, the right headlines, public outrage would follow almost automatically. The idea was to inflame opinion, to light a fire of patriotic anger that would burn away hesitation about military intervention. Control the story, and you control the response. And perhaps most revealing of all is something called the Remember the Maine strategy. This wasn't a new invention, but a deliberate echo of history. Back in 1898, the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor helped spark the Spanish-American War. The cause of that explosion is still debated, but its effect was undeniable. It rallied Americans to war. Operation Northwoods proposed deliberately creating a similar moment, engineered outrage to evoke patriotic support. In other words, borrow the logic of the past, package it for the Cold War, and use it again. This is the world inside the Northwoods document: fabricated violence, staged hijackings, manipulated media, and recycled propaganda strategies. A playbook for manufacturing war through illusion. And if this seems extreme, it's because it was. But the next question is just as important: what kind of institutional mindset could make such a proposal seem reasonable in the first place? That's where we turn next. Now we need to step back from the scenarios themselves and ask, what sort of mindset allows a plan like this to even exist? That brings us to the institutional logic and moral blind spots behind Operation Northwoods. Because this wasn't just about a single proposal, it revealed how large bureaucracies can sometimes think and act when the pressure is high. First, there's what we might call bureaucratic momentum. In the world of national security, once an idea enters the system, it tends to move forward with its own energy. Planners are trained to think in terms of operational effectiveness. Can it be done? How quickly? What resources are needed? Ethical reflection often gets pushed to the side. It's not necessarily that individuals lack conscience, it's that the institution itself rewards efficiency and results. When the clock is ticking, the question, is this right, often loses to the will this work? Then there's moral disengagement. Hidden operations bypass the court of public opinion, and when secrecy is the rule, ethical barriers start to fall. Decision-makers may convince themselves that the ends justify the means, or that the public simply couldn't understand the complexities of strategy. Once that rationalization sets in, it becomes easier to propose actions that would shock the very citizens being protected. We also see what can be called casus belli manufacturing. Casus belli means justification for war. When natural provocations don't exist, some leaders start to imagine ways to create them. In a democracy, where public support is crucial, the absence of outrage becomes a problem to be solved. If the people won't demand action on their own, the logic goes, perhaps an engineered crisis will force their hand. It is a chilling reminder that wars are sometimes less about reaction and more about persuasion. And finally, there's systemic conflict. This is the tension between democratic values: transparency, public consent, accountability, and centralized strategic reasoning, which often thrives in secrecy and controlled narratives. The Northwoods plan sits right at this crossroads. On one hand, the military wanted operational clarity. On the other, the very notion of staging violence or deception violated the ethical contract between government and governed. That clash of values exposes a fault line that still runs through modern debates about security and liberty. So when we look at Operation Northwoods, it's not just about the shocking proposals. It's about the institutional mindset that allowed them to seem like options on the table. And that, perhaps, is even more important to understand, because it raises the next question: if such a plan existed, why was it rejected? That's what we turn to now. So, why wasn't Operation Northwoods ever carried out? That brings us to its rejection, and the reasons matter just as much as the plan itself. Because what we see here is not only a clash of strategies, but also a glimpse into the fragile balance of power between civilian leadership and the military establishment during the Cold War. At the top of this story is President John F. Kennedy. When the plan reached his desk, he refused it. Kennedy had already been burned by the Bay of Pigs fiasco just a year earlier, and he knew what it meant to gamble credibility on covert schemes. Approving something as radical as Northwoods would have risked his administration's legitimacy, not just at home but around the world. Kennedy understood that winning the Cold War wasn't only about force, it was about narrative, about America's image as the defender of freedom. Manufacturing a war through deception would have shattered that image. In that sense, his rejection wasn't just a political calculation, it was a moral line in the sand. This decision revealed deep civil-military tensions. The Joint Chiefs believed they were offering a bold solution to a stubborn problem. Kennedy saw it as reckless and dangerous. That gap in perspective tells us something critical. Even at the highest levels, the goals of military planners and civilian leaders don't always align. The military often focuses on achieving decisive outcomes. The president has to think about legitimacy, diplomacy, and the long-term consequences. Northwoods highlighted just how wide that gap could be. General Lyman Lemnitzer, the man who had championed the plan, soon found himself reassigned. He was moved from his role as chairman of the Joint Chiefs to a NATO position. Officially, this was just a routine shift, but the timing spoke volumes. It was a signal that Kennedy did not want Lemnitzer's kind of thinking driving America's top military strategies. In a quiet but unmistakable way, it was a rebuke, and perhaps the most remarkable part of the story is this: the entire plan remained buried in classified files for decades. It wasn't until 1997, when declassified documents were released to the public, that citizens finally learned the details. For over 30 years, this blueprint for false flag operations sat in secrecy, unknown to the very people it was supposed to manipulate. So the rejection of Operation Northwoods was a turning point. It showed the limits of military influence, it revealed Kennedy's refusal to cross a certain ethical threshold, and it left behind a buried paper trail that would not see the light of day until the end of the 20th century. And yet, even in rejection, the plan casts a long shadow. The next step is to see what kind of legacy it left behind. Now let's talk about the legacy of Operation Northwoods and why it still matters today. Even though the plan was never executed, its very existence left behind ripples that go far beyond the early 1960s. First, there's the erosion of trust. When the Northwoods documents were finally declassified in 1997, many Americans were stunned. The idea that their own military leadership had once drawn up plans to stage attacks on US citizens or assets was almost unthinkable. And yet, there it was in black and white. Even though the proposal was rejected, simply knowing it was drafted made people question what else might have been considered or hidden over the years. Trust, once shaken, is hard to rebuild. Second, Operation Northwoods is a reminder of hidden histories. For decades, this proposal lived in the shadows, unseen by the very public it was meant to influence. Its later exposure shows us how easily critical events and decisions can be locked away, reshaping how history is told or not told. We like to think we have the full story of the past, but Northwoods is proof that sometimes, entire chapters remain sealed until long after the fact. Third, the plan set an important precedent for scrutiny. Once people learned about it, it became harder to dismiss questions about government transparency. Historians, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike began to point to Northwoods as an example of why official narratives must always be questioned. It became a reference point in discussions of covert operations, reminding us that not all proposals see the light of day, and not all truths are revealed in real time. And finally, Operation Northwoods underscores the importance of democratic safeguards. Civilian control over the military, freedom of the press, and mechanisms for accountability aren't just abstract ideals, they're the barriers that prevent ideas like this from becoming reality. When those safeguards weaken, the temptation to bypass public consent in the name of security grows stronger. So the legacy of Northwoods isn't just about one plan that never happened. It's about what it represents, the fragility of trust, the danger of secrecy, and the enduring need to keep power accountable. And that leads us directly to the final reflections and the questions we're still left with today. And now we come to the final reflections. This is where Operation Northwoods stops being just a Cold War story and becomes a mirror, forcing us to ask timeless questions about power, morality, and the way history is shaped. The first question is moral reckoning. If leaders are willing to design a plan that sacrifices truth, and potentially lives, to achieve strategic goals, what does that say about the moral boundaries of power? Can a government claim to defend freedom while secretly plotting to manipulate its own citizens? These are not just historical questions. They echo into every age where leaders weigh ends against means. Next is the issue of checks against abuse. Northwoods reminds us that democratic systems only work when there are strong barriers against concentrated power. Civilian oversight, open debate, investigative journalism, These are not luxuries, they are protections. Without them, proposals like Northwoods might not stay locked in filing cabinets. They might become policy. Then there's the danger of secrecy. For 35 years, this plan remained hidden from public knowledge. What happens when entire nations operate on stories that leave out the most important truths? When secrecy becomes routine, citizens are left navigating shadows, never quite sure what to believe. And once secrecy erodes trust, regaining it can take generations. Finally, the question of accountability in centralized versus decentralized systems. Operation Northwoods was born out of a highly centralized mindset, a small group of leaders imagining they could shape public opinion through manipulation. But history suggests that when information flows more freely, when decision-making is shared and scrutinized, it becomes harder for such plans to survive. Does decentralization create stronger safeguards against abuse? That's a question worth keeping alive. So as we close, remember, Operation Northwoods was never carried out, but its existence is a warning. It teaches us to keep asking questions, to stay vigilant, and to recognize that history often hides more than it reveals. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more episodes of Truth Behind History. And if you want to go even further into the hidden corners of the past, check out my book History They Tried to Erase, link is in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.